December 7, 1941, Wheeler Field, Hawaii, 7:53 in the morning. Second Lieutenant George Welch awoke to a sound that didn't belong in paradise, the thunderous crash of exploding bombs. He races outside in whatever clothes he can grab and sees it. Thick, black smoke billowing over Pearl Harbor just miles away. The harbor where America's Pacific Fleet sits is anchored on a peaceful Sunday morning. Except this Sunday won't be peaceful. In the next 2 hours, George Welch and a handful of other American pilots will defy impossible odds, take to the skies in outdated aircraft with minimal ammunition, and engage in a desperate aerial battle that history has largely forgotten. This is the story of the few who fought back when America was caught completely unprepared. This is the story of the valiant air defense at Pearl Harbor. When we think of Pearl Harbor, we picture burning battleships, the USS Arizona engulfed in flames, and rows of destroyed aircraft lined up on airfields like sitting ducks. What most people don't know is that above the chaos and destruction, a small number of American fighter pilots managed to get airborne and fought back against the Japanese attackers. This wasn't the massive aerial battle you might imagine from war movies. This was a handful of men, sometimes still in their pajamas, racing to salvage whatever aircraft they could find, loading whatever ammunition was available, and launching themselves into a sky filled with enemy fighters and bombers. The air-to-air combat that occurred over Hawaii that morning was brief, chaotic, and desperate. A few Hawaiians who lived near the military bases actually heard the distinctive whine of engines and the sharp chatter of machine guns as American Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks dueled with Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighters high above. These engagements were small in scale, but enormous in courage, and they reveal something crucial about that day. Even when caught completely by surprise, even when facing overwhelming odds, some Americans refused to simply watch their country be attacked. They fought back with everything they had. To understand how these pilots managed to fight at all, you first need to understand just how unprepared the American forces were that morning. Lieutenant General Walter Short commanded Army forces in Hawaii, and he was worried about the wrong threat entirely. Short believed the greatest danger came from Japanese sympathizers living on Oahu who might sabotage American aircraft and equipment. To protect against this perceived threat, he made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He ordered his commanders to park all the aircraft, the P-36s, P-40s, A-20 attack bombers, and B-18 bombers, wingtip-to-wingtip on the flight lines at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, and other airfields across the island. Think about that for a moment. Every single aircraft lined up in neat, tight rows touching each other, perfect protection against saboteurs creeping onto the base at night. Also, perfect targets for attacking aircraft. One bomb, one strafing run, could destroy multiple planes at once. The irony is painful. In trying to protect the aircraft from one threat, Short had made them exponentially more vulnerable to the real threat that was coming, and it gets worse. At Short's direction, the radar sites scattered around the Hawaiian Islands operated only part-time. On the morning of December 7th, they were scheduled to shut down at 7 o'clock in the morning, just 53 minutes before the attack began. The few radar operators who were on duty that morning did detect something. They saw a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, but everyone assumed these were the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers expected to arrive from the mainland. 12 B-17s were indeed approaching Oahu, just 3 degrees off the heading of the Japanese warplanes. But there were also 170 Japanese torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters arriving from 6 aircraft carriers. The American Air Forces in Hawaii were flying outdated equipment by any standard. 39 P-36 Mohawk fighters, 87 P-40B Tomahawks, and 12 P-40C Tomahawks. The bombers were even more obsolete. On December 7th, a few of these fighters had fuel or ammunition loaded aboard. Why would they? It was peacetime. It was Sunday morning, as Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Austin, commander of the 47th Pursuit Squadron, would later say, quote, "We did not anticipate what came." At Hickam Field, just outside Honolulu, Base Commander Colonel William Farthing was in the control tower early that morning, waiting for those B-17s. He watched as the first Japanese aircraft appeared over the harbor and immediately began attacking the ships below. Then they turned toward the airfield. Farthing would later say it was, quote, "only human ingenuity that enabled a few Army pilots to climb aloft and engage the attackers. Human ingenuity and raw courage." The Japanese battle plan specifically stressed the importance of destroying American airfields. The Japanese commanders knew that if long-range American aircraft survived, they could shadow the Japanese planes back to their carriers and give away their position. So they hit the airfields hard. Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and Bellows Field all came under devastating attack. The first wave of strafing runs destroyed aircraft, maintenance hangars, fuel depots, and other structures. An hour later, a second wave hit again, finishing what the first wave started. One of the first casualties was a B-24 Liberator bomber being prepared by First Lieutenant Ted Faulkner for a secret photo reconnaissance mission. A Japanese dive bomber pilot named Lieutenant Kunikiya Hira dropped a bomb directly on Hangar 15, and Faulkner's B-24 erupted in flames, killing 2 of the crew. This aircraft had the unfortunate distinction of being the first American plane lost in World War II. Those B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland flew straight into a nightmare. They were unarmed, low on fuel, and scattered across the skies trying to find somewhere, anywhere, to land safely while Japanese fighters swarmed around them. First Lieutenant Frank Bostrom attempted to land multiple times, evaded 0 fighters, and finally put his flying fortress down on the Kahuku golf course. Bostrom, remarkably, would survive to achieve fame later in the war for helping evacuate General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines to Australia. On the ground, chaos reigned. Explosions rocked the airfields, aircraft burned, buildings collapsed, and 700 Army Air Force personnel would be dead or wounded by the end of the day. 2/3 of America's air power on Oahu was damaged or destroyed, but not everyone was caught on the ground. At Wheeler Field, Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, both young fighter pilots, were jolted awake by the sound of bombs exploding. They rushed outside and immediately saw smoke rising from Pearl Harbor. Taylor didn't waste time asking permission or following protocol. He grabbed a telephone and called the grass airstrip at Haleiwa, 10 miles from Honolulu. The 47th Pursuit Squadron had been using Haleiwa for target practice, and some of their P-40 Tomahawks were there. Taylor shouted orders to the ground crews: "Get 2 P-40s fueled and armed for combat immediately." Then Welch and Taylor jumped into a car and drove at breakneck speed toward Haleiwa. Japanese aircraft strafed them during the drive. Bullets kicked up dirt around their car. They kept driving. When they arrived at Haleiwa, their P-40s were ready, though only partly loaded with machine gun rounds. There hadn't been time for a full combat load. It would have to be enough. They took off and immediately attacked a formation of Nakajima Kate bombers. These were the torpedo bombers that had just devastated Pearl Harbor. Welch and Taylor dove into the formation, guns blazing. Each shot 1 down. Moments later, a Japanese tail gunner hit Welch's P-40 with return fire, but Welch pressed his attack. He and Taylor each shot down another Kate. Low on ammunition, they landed back at Wheeler Field to refuel and rearm. The field was still under attack. Bombs were still falling. Aircraft were burning. They didn't care. They loaded up and took off again. Welch would fly 3 separate combat sorties that morning, an almost superhuman feat given the circumstances. On his second sortie, he spotted a Japanese Zero locking onto Taylor's tail. Welch maneuvered behind the Zero, fired precise bursts, and sent it spiraling down. His third kill of the day. Later, Welch flew to Iwa and found a lone Japanese aircraft. He shot it down, his fourth kill of December 7th. George Welch would go on to become a 16-kill ace during World War II and later a test pilot pioneering jet aviation before tragically losing his life in an F-100 Super Sabre in 1954. Kenneth Taylor would rise to the rank of brigadier general and is still alive today, living in Alaska. Both men were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military honor. Over the years, a legend grew that Welch was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but that the military suppressed it because he had taken off without authorization. Some versions claim the brass didn't want to publicize the defeat at Pearl Harbor. Other versions say a hero was needed immediately and Congress would take too long to act. None of this is true. Welch's bravery was real and was recognized. He simply wasn't nominated for the Medal of Honor. He needed no authorization to take off in his own aircraft. And as for avoiding publicity, the military awarded Medals of Honor with great fanfare to 15 others for their actions at Pearl Harbor. At Wheeler Field, another pilot was having his own extraordinary morning. Second Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen woke to explosions and chaos. Along with other pilots, he struggled to arm and fuel the older P-36 Mohawk fighters. The P-36 was already obsolete, slower and less capable than the Japanese aircraft it would face, and Rasmussen was still wearing his purple pajamas. There was no time to change. He climbed into the cockpit in his sleepwear and took off into the maelstrom. Rasmussen and 3 other P-36 pilots climbed to 9,000 feet and spotted Japanese Val dive bombers below. Rasmussen recalled later, quote, "We dove to attack them. First Lieutenant Lewis Sanders, despite flying the slower P-36, got behind one of the raiders and shot it down. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sterling also shot down a Japanese aircraft, but then was himself shot down over water. Sterling managed to get out of his aircraft, but he drowned. Rasmussen witnessed his death. Then something bizarre happened to Rasmussen. He charged his guns, the standard procedure before firing, but they started firing on their own. He couldn't stop them. As he struggled with his malfunctioning weapons, a Japanese aircraft passed directly in front of him and exploded. Whether Rasmussen's guns hit it or another pilot did, he never knew for certain. Rasmussen managed to shake off 2 Zero fighters on his tail and got his guns under control. He raked another Japanese aircraft with gunfire, scoring hits. Then he felt his own aircraft shudder as enemy rounds tore into it. He heard a tremendous noise as a Japanese fighter shot his canopy completely off. The P-36 tumbled out of control into the clouds. The hydraulic lines were severed. The tail wheel was shot off. The aircraft was barely flyable. What Rasmussen didn't know yet was that 2 cannon shells had buried themselves in the radio equipment mounted behind his pilot seat. That bulky radio had saved his life. Somehow, Rasmussen navigated through smoke-shrouded skies back to Wheeler Field, where explosions were still going off and aircraft were still burning. He landed his shot-up P-36 without brakes, without a rudder, and without a tail wheel. The rear fuselage had dozens of bullet holes. There was no other aircraft available, so Rasmussen's fighting was done for the day. He was awarded the Silver Star. He would shoot down a second Japanese aircraft in 1943, and remarkably, he's still alive today, living in Hawaii. While the pilots fought in the air, nurses and doctors fought to save lives on the ground. First Lieutenant Annie Guyton Fox, chief nurse at Hickam Field, woke that morning to a crescendo of explosions and gunfire. 82 Army nurses were serving in the Hawaiian Islands that day, at Tripler Army Hospital, Schofield Hospital, and at Hickam Station Hospital. Second Lieutenant Monica Conter had been on a date the night before with Army Second Lieutenant Barney Benning, who would later become her husband of more than 60 years. They had attended a dance at the Pearl Harbor Officers Club and noticed the harbor was full of Navy ships. Conter recalled, quote, "It was the most beautiful sight I've ever seen, all the battleships and the lights, with the reflection on the water. We were just overwhelmed. Less than 12 hours later, those beautiful battleships would be burning and sinking. At 7 in the morning on December 7th, 50 minutes before the attack, Conter reported for duty at Hickam with Second Lieutenant Irene Boyd. They were the only nurses on duty. Conter remembered, quote, "We heard this plane. It was losing altitude. We both just stopped suddenly and stared at each other. Then, bang! A 500-pound bomb landed on the front lawn of the hospital. Miraculously, it didn't explode. It sat there, 60 or 70 feet from patients, a dud. Some troops thought they smelled gas and began shouting warnings. Some at Hickam donned gas masks, adding to the confusion. Nurse Fox arrived and organized her team of 8 nurses to handle the flood of wounded being brought in. Conter, Kathleen Coberly, and the others improvised constantly, dealing with far more casualties than they had ever trained for. Fox's calm leadership and courage proved invaluable. She would later become the first of many Army nurses to receive the Purple Heart Medal. Though she wasn't wounded herself, she received it for her, quote, "fine example of calmness, courage, and leadership, which was of great benefit to the morale of all she came in contact with." One of the wounded was a flight surgeon who had arrived on one of the B-17s from the mainland. First Lieutenant William Schick sat on the stairs to the second floor of the hospital, still wearing his winter uniform, never worn in Hawaii, bleeding profusely from his head and face. He repeatedly refused medical care, pointing to casualties on litters on the floor and urging the responders to, quote, "take care of them." Despite his resistance, he was finally put in an ambulance headed for Tripler Hospital, but he died before arriving. Today, Hickam's hospital is named for William Schick. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft attacked Oahu, American pilots continued taking off individually from different airfields, sometimes linking up after getting airborne. George Welch took off on his second sortie, while Kenneth Taylor waited for what he thought was the last Japanese aircraft in a formation to pass overhead, then took off again, hoping to get them in his gun sight from behind. At Bellows Field, First Lieutenant Samuel Bishop and Second Lieutenant George Whiteman attempted to take off in 2 more P-40s. Bishop got airborne, but Japanese Zeros swarmed over him, and he crashed into the ocean. Whiteman was hit as he cleared the ground and went down at the end of the runway. Bishop, though wounded, managed to swim to shore. Whiteman lost his life. 6 other pilots managed to get airborne from Wheeler in a mix of P-36s and P-40s. Second Lieutenant John Danes flew 3 separate sorties that morning, 2 in a P-40 and 1 in a P-36. He apparently shot down a Zero that was observed falling from the sky by Army Air Force radar operators. However, the record is unclear because shortly after, Dines was shot down and killed by American anti-aircraft fire, a tragic case of friendly fire in the chaos of battle. First Lieutenant Harry Brown apparently scored the last confirmed kill of the day when he shot down a Zero as it headed out to sea. The second wave of the Japanese attack was over. At Hickam Field, Douglas A-20 Havoc attack bombers had been battered and burned during the raids. As the Japanese aircraft retired, Major William Holtzapfel led 4 A-20s into the air at 11:27 in the morning. Their mission was to search for and attack a Japanese carrier reported incorrectly to be south of Barber's Point on Oahu. Bombs and fuel had been loaded with great difficulty, but by the time they got airborne, it was too late. The Japanese fleet was long gone. The Pearl Harbor attack killed 2,403 people. most of them American servicemen, and wounded 1,104 others. The Japanese conceded the loss of 29 aircraft. Of those, the Army Air Force downed 10, including 6 shot down by Taylor and Welch alone. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Austin, the commander of the 47th Pursuit Squadron, who had been away hunting on another island that morning, returned to Wheeler Field to find all his aircraft shot to pieces, along with buildings, people, and his 1941 Mercury sedan. He believed that if the squadrons had prepared for air attack instead of ground sabotage, most of his P-40s would have gotten into the sky that day. Casualties would surely have been far higher but for the courage and improvisation of doctors and nurses who worked under fire to save lives. And the casualties might have been even worse if not for a handful of pilots who refused to accept defeat. Men who raced to whatever aircraft they could find, loaded whatever ammunition was available, and took to the skies against overwhelming odds. Some wore pajamas, some flew planes shot full of holes, some died trying. But they all fought back when America needed them most. That's the real story of the air battle over Pearl Harbor, not a tale of defeat, but a story of defiance.